Hello! These days, everyone's digging through pretty much the same sample websites, which means a lot of producers end up using the exact same sounds and loops. So if you're just dropping these loops straight into your tracks, there's an almost 100% chance someone else already used that exact same loop. And you might even run into copyright issues. Just try shazamming any melodic loop from Splice and you'll see for yourself. It's actually getting pretty ridiculous. That's why it's so important to get creative with these loops, especially the melodic ones. In this two-part video, I'm gonna show you 10 creative ways to transform loops so they sound fresh, unique, and truly like you. Before we dive in, just a quick note that you can find all of the track stems for every technique I cover in this video, plus full track breakdowns where I go into all the fine details of my songs over on Patreon. With that being said, don't forget to hit subscribe and let's jump right in. Now, let's say you found a drum loop and you like the pattern and the groove, but you're not really a big fan of the sounds and they don't fit your track. Well, let me show you how you can extract the rhythm and apply it to your own drum sounds in just a few steps. Here's a loop from my Donut Drums 2 sample pack. The first thing we'll do is right-click our audio clip and select Convert Drums to New MIDI Track. Live has now converted the groove into a MIDI pattern and assigned it to its default 606 drum machine sounds. When I bring in the original loop, you can hear that they line up perfectly. Now, one important thing to note here is that Live creates a MIDI note for every hit that's marked with a light gray transient marker, but if Live misses a hit, you can manually add a marker to make sure it's detected. Live will then automatically analyze the sound and place a MIDI note for it in the correct drum slot. If we look at the detected velocities, you'll notice that they're pretty much all over the place, which isn't ideal. But a quick way to fix this is by using Ableton's velocity MIDI effect. The out high parameter sets the maximum velocity for the MIDI note, so if we set it to 100 for example, any note with a higher velocity will be reduced back to 100. The out low parameter does the opposite and will boost the velocity of any note that falls below this value. This means that if we set both parameters to 100, every single note will hit at a value of 100. From my experience, setting the out low value to around 70 or 80 gives the most natural results for these kind of beats. Alright, now to lock in these velocity changes, we'll simply duplicate the track, clear the existing clip, and set the new track to receive MIDI from the original drum MIDI channel. If we then hit record, Live will re-record the MIDI clip but with the adjusted velocities. And if we take a quick look at this new clip here, you can see that all the velocities now fall in the range that we set using the velocity tool. First, let's delete all the sounds from this drum rack that we're not using in our MIDI clip. While we could swap out the sounds directly in this drum rack, I prefer having each drum sound on a separate track for better clarity and flexibility. We can do this easily by right-clicking each drum rack layer and selecting Extract Chain, which moves the sound and its MIDI notes to a new MIDI track. Cool, now let's rename these tracks like model students and start swapping out the sounds. We'll start off with the kick drum. This kick sounds pretty nice actually. It could work well as some kind of sub-kick to layer in with the original break for extra weight, but for this track I'm gonna go with a more hip-hop inspired sound. So let's dive into my Donut Drums 3 sample pack and grab one of these more acoustic sounding kicks. I'll grab both of these refined kicks. One is the main kick and the other one is more kind of a pre-kick, which will add subtle ghost notes to enhance the groove. We'll set the velocity to 100% and then hit copy value to siblings so this adjustment applies to all the other sounds in the rack as well. Let's drag the kicks that fall on the beat to the main kick and the in-between notes to the shorter, more subdued ghost kick. This will add a way more natural and human feel compared to having the same kick every time. Let's run the pattern and balance out the volumes of both kicks now. The ghost kick is a bit too quiet here, so let's bring up the volume just enough to keep it slightly softer than the main kick. Alright, that sounds great, so let's move over to the snare. I want the snares to hit at full force every time here, so I'll select all the notes, drag their velocities all the way up to even them out, and then bring them back down to 100. Let's see what snares we've got in this Donut Drums 3-pack. This interlace one sounds nice and crispy, so let's swap it out with the 606 in our drum rack and set the velocity to 100%. Let's listen to the kick and the snare combined. We're definitely starting to feel that Dilla style swing here, but a huge part of the vibe comes from the hi-hats, so let's dive into those and see how we can tweak them. A whole lot of swing in this loop, so let's see if we can find some sounds. Let's drag both of these triplet ones into our drum rack. Let's set the velocity of both hi-hats to 100 again using the copy value to siblings feature. Then, just like with the kicks, I'll drag the hats that fall on each beat to the main hat and the in-between ones to the smaller hat. Feel free to experiment with a pattern here, because an interesting hi-hat groove can make a really big difference in the overall feel and groove of the drums. Now let's balance out these hi-hats. And I think I'll also make the smaller hat even shorter and try to get rid of some of the noise that's embedded into the hi-hat sample. Sweet, now let's group these bad boys and listen to the drum group. Let's compare. The drum group's clipping now, so let's bring down the volume of the drum layers. Just for fun, let's glue the drum bus together with a glue compressor. I'm gonna activate the high pass filter here on the sidechain to keep the kick from triggering it too much. And then I'll set a slow attack and fast release for just a few dB of transparent compression. And let's add some extra character with a saturator. I'm just dialing in enough to give the drum some warmth and punch without overcooking them. And then let's top it off with a limiter to bring up the volume. Let's compare both again. And let's see what happens when we layer them. One of my favorite tricks with this approach, especially when using the groove from a live drum break, is to high pass the break and then use a transient designer like Transient Master to soften the transients with a slow attack. If we then blend it back in, we can reintroduce some of that nice, characterful live sound without interfering with our own kick and snare. If you're working with live drum breaks or drum recordings, this is a great way to layer them with electronic sounds for extra weight or a different texture. And that is how you can take a drum groove and make it your own. On to the next one. For the second technique, we're gonna explore a rather unconventional way to chop up a sample. Let's check out this 5B melodic loop that I found on Splice. So in a hilariously ironic twist of events, this video actually got a copyright claim on this exact section where I was playing a melodic loop from Splice. But if I throw some drums underneath it, we should be good to go. Now, with a tempo of 90 BPM and a warm, tapey, vintage kind of sound, this loop is likely meant for a boom-bap hip-hop beat. But to me, it instantly gave off this late 90s, early 2000s Daft Punk, Justice, French house kind of vibe, so I put together a disco-inspired loop to chop the sample to. Alright, now I bet that if we just add some sidechaining to this melodic loop, it will already sound pretty tight. Let's see. Yeah, this already sounds pretty banging, to be honest. But let's be a little more creative and turn it into something we can call our own. The first thing we'll do is set up a Simpler and copy over the sidechain compressor. Now let's drag our loop into Simpler and switch it to slice mode. Here you can choose to what division the loop will be sliced. I'll go for half a beat for now. Let's create an empty MIDI clip here and use Live 12's new MIDI Generative tools to quickly generate a pattern for us. Let's head over to the MIDI Generative Tools tab here. First, we'll need to set the note range that Live will use to generate a random pattern. Usually C1 will be the very first chop, which is also the case here. Now let's check the highest note, which appears to be D sharp too. Now let's enter this under the little pitch section here. As you can see, Live has already generated a pattern here within this range, but let's shorten the clip to a 2-bar loop. Because French house often relies on very short, repetitive patterns, and we want to honor the French grades here, so let's do the same. Cool, now let's listen to this pattern for a second. Listening with the drums will give us a better idea. By selecting all the notes and hitting generate, we can keep on creating new patterns until we find something that feels right. Live automatically quantizes the pattern to the grid, so let's see how it changes when we set the grid to 1/8 notes. Let's switch it up again. Right now, the trigger mode is set to trigger, meaning each chop plays in its entirety no matter the MIDI note length. If we set it to gate, however, the chop will only play for as long as the note lasts, which creates a very cool, tight and chopped up feel that works great for the French house sound. Sounds pretty cool, so let's duplicate the loop now to make it 4 bars in length and tweak a few notes to add variation and keep it evolving. Alright, let's try setting the slicing division on the Simpler to a 1/4 note now, and let's see what happens. With more chops in play now, we're introducing new textures too, which instantly makes the loop a lot more dynamic and interesting, I think. Here's the loop I came up with after some final tweaks and adding extra instrumentation. So next time you find a sample that you like, don't just drop it in your project, but experiment, chop, and tweak it to make it truly yours. On to the next technique. For this one, we'll be again using a sample, but this time we'll take it in an entirely new direction. Now, for the same reason here, I can't play the splice sample, but just picture a smooth, peaceful, loungy stack of sounds. Now let me show you an incredible and free plugin called Polstretch. This plugin will take any piece of audio and stretch it into the most beautiful atmospheric pads using Pol's extreme time stretch algorithm. According to their website, it can turn any audio into hours or days of ambient soundscapes in an amazingly smooth and beautiful way. Let's see if this holds up. I'll drag in the sample, and with the stretch amount set to 1, you can see in the top right corner that it's about 24 seconds long. But if I crank it all the way up, it stretches to a mind-blowing 6 hours and 49 minutes. Pure insanity. Let's dial the stretch amount back to around 10, which will extend the sample to just over 4 minutes, and listen to what it sounds like. Anyway, let's render it and import it into Live. Alright, we've got the rendered and time stretch sample here, so let's take a listen and see if there are any interesting textures we can work with. Yeah, pretty much every part of this sounds epic. My man Pol's algorithm is on another level, man. I've tried stretching audio by awkwardly large amounts in Ableton before, but it always ended up sounding pretty rough. But this is pure magic, so thanks, Paul. In the meantime, I've added a simpler to a new MIDI channel here, into which I'll drag our stretched audio file. Let's unwarp and normalize this bad boy and smooth it out even more by adding a very slow attack and very long release to give it that evolving pad-like quality. I'm playing this on my MIDI keyboard here, by the way. Let's play it an octave down. You could easily turn this into a sick Hans Zimmer type beat. And this was just one section of the file, so let's try another one. Let's try 2 octaves down. I hope you're still awake at this point. Alright, it's pretty incredible stuff. So if you're ever in need of big cinematic pads, better call Polstretch. Alright, for this next technique I've imported a variety of drum loops into Ableton. Each one has its own unique character and groove, and if I were to play them all together as they are, it would create a pretty chaotic mix. By chopping out the best sections from each drum loop, like the kick drum from one, the snare from another, and so on, I can create a unique drum collage that feels like a completely new loop. If you're still hearing the tails of a kick or the reverb of a snare in your hi-hats, you can always tighten the transients under the warp section to clean them up. Another great way to make certain elements sit better in the groove is by sidechaining them to the kick or snare to help them blend more naturally into the rhythm. If things are still sounding a little detached, you could try blending in a subtle layer like a vinyl crackle or some tape noise to glue everything together and make the loop feel a little more cohesive. So next time you're digging through loops, don't just listen to them as a whole, but focus on individual sounds that stand out to you. Isolate those elements, blend them with others, and create something entirely new. Alright, for this next tip, I've pulled a couple of loops from the Golden pack that I made for Sennheiser a while back, which you might have come across on Splice too. Let's take a quick listen. Now let's have some fun with Wavetable. I'm gonna drop in an instance on this MIDI track, which already has a MIDI clip loaded from the same sample pack. I'm gonna spice it up a bit with some reverb and delay on a return channel, and I'll also boost the output gain of Wavetable, because I know from experience it tends to come out a bit quiet. Now, what exactly is a wavetable synthesizer? Well, unlike classic synths that use a single waveform like a sine, a triangle, or a square wave, a wavetable synth uses wavetables, which are basically a collection of waveforms that you can scroll through to shape your sound in more dynamic ways. The default wavetable that loads in Live's Wavetable synth is called Basic Shapes and includes a sine, a triangle, a saw, and a square wave. We can easily morph between these waveforms in this wavetable using the oscillator position slider over here on the right. As we're morphing through these basic shapes, we're actually creating new waveforms that lie in between them. The warp and fold parameters at the bottom will really let you twist and bend the wavetable in very creative ways. So by combining these oscillator position, warp, and fold parameters, you can really sculpt the wavetable into something special and come up with very textural and rich sounds. So now you're probably thinking, okay, that's cool and all, but what does this have to do with being creative with loops? Well, one of the most fun features of Ableton's Wavetable synth is that you can import any sound and use it as a wavetable. Just to show you, I'm gonna dive into one of my sample packs and scroll through a few melodic hits to find one we can use here. You can drag in pretty much any sample and Wavetable will turn it into something usable, but from what I've found, textured sounds usually give the most interesting results, which is why I went with this particular flute sample. Let's try an octave down here maybe? Yeah, this creates a lot more variation for this wavetable. Ooh, and some pretty sick alien type sounds here too. Alright, now let's make the sound a bit more alive. I'll start out by shaping the amp envelope to something a little more plucky. And then I'll head over to the mod matrix where we can start routing different modulation sources to various parameters. Let's map the amp envelope to the warp amount. To add even more texture, I'll use LFO1 to modulate the wavetable position. But we'll need to disable retrigger on the LFO so it doesn't restart with every new note. Let's modulate the fold amount with LFO2. And let's see what happens when we set this LFO to a random waveform. If you dial in a negative modulation amount, the parameter will move in the opposite direction. Let's try some meta modulation here and see what happens when we use envelope 3 to modulate the rate of LFO1, which is already modulating the wavetable position. If the modulation starts to get a bit out of control, you can always dial back the global modulation amount to keep things more in check. This is way faster than having to adjust every individual mod source. You can also use the drop down at the top to quickly scroll through other samples that are in the same folder as the one we selected, which is super useful for trying out different source material on the fly. Let's move on to Wavetable's filter. I'm gonna set up a quick filter envelope here using the MS2 filter, and I'll dial in a bit of dry for some extra character. This filter type really shines when you push the resonance, so let's crank it and hear how it reacts. Alright, good stuff. Let's drop in an EQ to shape the tone a bit and then add a compressor to even out the dynamics across the notes. Let's copy over the sidechain compressor from one of the other elements and tweak the sound in the context of the song. I actually like this sound better pitched up an octave, so let's leave it at that for now. Another cool thing about Wavetable is that you get a second oscillator, which means we can load in another completely separate wavetable. I'm gonna drop in this bass guitar sample to layer under our pluck, just to give it a bit more low-end support. Right now, only the filter modulation is hitting the second wavetable because both oscillators share the same filter. But we can still modulate stuff from oscillator 2 in the mod matrix just like we did with oscillator 1. Let's bring oscillator 1 back in and blend in oscillator 2 until they nicely complement each other. Alright, this has turned into a pretty nice textural and vibey pluck, and if you remember, it all started from just a trumpet and an electric bass sample. Pretty cool stuff. So far we've only used melodic sounds for our wavetables, but let's switch it up and try something percussive. This Moody Lo-Fi pack has a few hip-hop drum loops too, so I'm gonna grab one of those and see what kind of textures we can pull out of it. This one sounds pretty tight, so let's throw it in and see what comes out. Since there's a lot of space between the drum hits, a big chunk of the wavetable ends up being silence. Which actually creates this very cool glitchy effect that I absolutely love. Let's just mess around here for a bit and see what comes out. A good tip is to set up another audio track to record everything while you're playing around, because you never know when a happy accident may arise, and this way you won't miss it. What I like about these wavetables is that adjusting the position just ever so slightly can completely change the vibe of the sound. Let's try another filter type here. Subtle movements can go a long way here. On the bottom left here, we can pick several oscillator effects to reshape the wavetable even further. For this sound, I like the modern setting the best. And just a quick reminder here that this super rich and textured sound came from a drum loop. Kinda crazy when you think about it. And just like that, you can turn any simple sample into a totally new sound with the magic of wavetable synthesis. Alright, that wraps up the first 5 tips for getting creative with loops. Stay tuned for part 2 that will be dropping very soon on this channel.